"Margaret Jenkins, Your Honor," came a clear, confident voice. Now Thomas looked up. The woman before him stood straight-backed in a simple but elegant navy suit. Her dark skin contrasted with a cream blouse, and her hair was styled in a neat twist. Something about her composure made him pause. "Ms. Jenkins, you're charged with parking in a diplomatic zone without proper authorization. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," she replied. Her voice carried a slight accent that Thomas couldn't quite place. Perhaps West African. Thomas sighed. Everyone pleaded not guilty to parking tickets. It wasted the court's time and taxpayer money. "And what is your defense?" he asked, shuffling papers. "I was properly parked in a space reserved for diplomatic vehicles, which I am authorized to use." Thomas raised an eyebrow and glanced at the officer's report. "Officer Parker notes there was no diplomatic license plate visible, nor any credential displayed on the dashboard. If I may explain, Your Honor." "The sign clearly states that diplomatic credentials must be visible at all times," Thomas interrupted. Something about her confidence irritated him. He'd seen too many people try to talk their way out of simple violations. "I understand, but, Ms. Jenkins, this court has 20 more cases this morning. The fine is $200. Pay the clerk on your way out." The courtroom fell quiet. The prosecutor, Alan Miller, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even George the bailiff looked surprised at the judge's abruptness. Margaret Jenkins didn't move. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe you'll want to examine my credentials." Thomas felt his irritation grow. "Ms. Jenkins, I've made my ruling." A young clerk hurried forward and whispered something to George. The bailiff's eyes widened slightly before he approached the bench. "Your Honor," George whispered, "the clerk says there's been a call from the Foreign Office about this case." Thomas frowned. "What?" "Something about diplomatic status, sir." Thomas looked back at Margaret Jenkins with new interest. She stood calmly, waiting. "Ms. Jenkins, do you claim to have diplomatic status?" he asked, his tone changing slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," as I was attempting to explain. She reached into her leather portfolio and produced a small blue booklet, which she handed to George. The bailiff brought it to Thomas. It was a diplomatic passport, complete with official stamps and seals. According to the document, Margaret Jenkins was no ordinary citizen. She was Dr. Margaret Jenkins, Deputy Ambassador to the United Nations Economic Commission. Thomas felt his face grow warm. He'd been so quick to dismiss her, so certain she was just another person making excuses. "I see," he said, clearing his throat. "And you were at the diplomatic building for an emergency meeting regarding drought relief coordination, Your Honor. My driver fell ill suddenly, so I had to drive myself. The diplomatic permit was in the glove compartment rather than on the dashboard. My oversight." The courtroom remained silent as Thomas studied the passport. Everything was in order. More than in order. Dr. Jenkins outranked most people he knew. "The court withdraws the citation," Thomas announced, trying to maintain his composure. "You're free to go, Dr. Jenkins." She accepted her passport back with a slight nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." As she turned to leave, Thomas found himself calling out, "Dr. Jenkins, might I have a word with you in my chambers?" She paused, then nodded. "Of course." The prosecutor and bailiff exchanged glances as Thomas adjourned for a 15-minute recess and led Dr. Jenkins toward his private office. Thomas Brown had made a mistake, a significant one, and something told him this encounter would change more than just one case on a busy Monday morning. Thomas closed the door to his chambers, gesturing toward a leather chair across from his desk. The room felt smaller than usual, with its dark wood paneling and shelves lined with law books. A single window let in a slice of sunlight. "Please, sit down," he said, his voice softer than it had been in the courtroom. Dr. Jenkins sat with perfect posture, placing her portfolio neatly on her lap. She didn't speak, waiting for him to begin. Thomas settled into his chair, the familiar creak offering little comfort. He struggled to find the right words. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. "I made assumptions in there that were inappropriate." "Yes, you did. Dr. Jenkins replied simply. Her directness caught him off guard. Most people were intimidated in a judge's chambers, but she showed no sign of discomfort. I've been a judge for 15 years, Thomas continued. I like to think I'm fair, that I give everyone a proper hearing. And yet you didn't give me one, she observed. Thomas felt his face grow warm again. No, I didn't. I'd like to understand why. Dr. Jenkins studied him for a moment. Her eyes were kind but unflinching. Would you truly like to know? Or are you just being polite? I genuinely want to know. She nodded slightly. You looked at me and saw what you expected to see, not who was actually standing before you. The truth of her words settled heavily in Thomas's chest. He thought about how quickly he'd dismissed her, how he hadn't even properly looked at her until George had mentioned the Foreign Office call. You have quite a remarkable background, Thomas said, changing the subject slightly. How long have you been with the UN Commission? 7 years, she replied. Before that, I was Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court in my home country. Thomas nearly choked on his surprise. Chief Justice? For 11 years, she added. I specialized in international law and human rights cases. Thomas sat back in his chair, feeling suddenly very small. The woman he had so casually dismissed in traffic court had more judicial experience than he did. I had no idea, he said quietly. That's rather my point, Dr. Jenkins replied. Outside the window, clouds passed over the sun, dimming the light in the room. In the shadow, Thomas saw his own failure more clearly. What brought you to Bridgewater, he asked. I'm giving a lecture series at the University on International Law. I'm staying for 3 months. Thomas nodded, thinking of the modest university at the edge of town. They occasionally hosted distinguished visitors, but rarely someone of Dr. Jenkins's standing. The young clerk who recognized you, how did she know who you were? Dr. Jenkins smiled slightly. She attended my lecture yesterday. When she saw me enter the courtroom, she called the university to confirm and they contacted the Foreign Office. Lucky for you, Thomas said. No. Dr. Jenkins shook her head. Lucky for you. The statement hung in the air between them. Thomas felt its weight. What do you mean? He asked, though he suspected he knew. If I had chosen to make an official complaint about how I was treated in your courtroom, it could have become complicated. Diplomatically speaking, Thomas paled. She was right. Mistreating a foreign diplomat could have serious consequences, potentially even international ones. His quick dismissal could have created problems far beyond a simple traffic case. I wouldn't have done that, Dr. Jenkins added, seeing his expression. I don't believe in using position for personal advantage. Unlike me, Thomas said quietly. I use my position to avoid listening. Dr. Jenkins leaned forward slightly. May I speak frankly, Judge Brown? Please do. What happened in that courtroom happens every day to people who don't have diplomatic passports to save them. People whose voices are dismissed before they're even heard. Thomas Brown sat behind his large oak desk in Bridgewater District Court. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, highlighting dust particles floating in the air. At 62, Judge Brown had presided over this courtroom for 15 years. Lines etched his face like a well-used map, and silver hair crowned his head. Next case, he called, voice rough from the cold he'd been fighting all week. The bailiff, George, announced loudly. Parking violation, diplomatic zone. Fine recommended $200. Thomas barely looked up from his papers. Monday mornings meant traffic court, a parade of excuses that tested his already thin patience. He rubbed his tired eyes. Name? He asked. Her words struck Thomas like a physical blow. He thought of all the cases he'd rushed through, the faces he'd barely looked at. I have another lecture this afternoon, Dr. Jenkins said, rising from her chair. But I'm free tomorrow if you'd like to continue this conversation. Thomas stood quickly. I would. Perhaps over lunch? She nodded. Noon at the university cafe would work well. As Dr. Jenkins reached the door, she turned back. Judge Brown, recognizing one's mistakes is the first step toward making things right. Not everyone is willing to take that step. After she left, Thomas stood at his window, watching her cross the courthouse square. In just 30 minutes, Dr. Margaret Jenkins had shaken the foundation of everything he thought he knew about himself as a judge. Tomorrow's lunch, he suspected, would be the most important meal of his career. The university cafe bustled with activity as Thomas arrived 5 minutes before noon. Students hurried between tables, professors gathered in small groups, and the smell of coffee filled the air. Thomas felt out of place without his black robe and the authority of his courtroom. He spotted Dr. Jenkins at a corner table by a window, reading from a stack of papers. Sunlight highlighted the silver strands in her dark hair. She wore a simple, burgundy dress with a patterned scarf, looking more like a professor than a diplomat or chief justice. "Dr. Jenkins," Thomas greeted her, suddenly nervous. She looked up with a warm smile. "Judge Brown, please, join me." She gestured to the chair across from her. "And do call me Margaret. We're not in court now." Thomas sat down, placing his hat on the empty chair beside him. "Then I'm Thomas," he offered. A young waitress approached their table. Thomas noticed how she smiled with genuine respect at Margaret before taking their orders. A chicken salad for Margaret and a soup for Thomas. "Have you been enjoying your time at the university?" Thomas asked once the waitress left. "Very much," Margaret replied. "The students here ask excellent questions. They're curious about the world." "Unlike some judges," Thomas said with a self-deprecating smile. Margaret studied him thoughtfully. "You've been thinking about our conversation." "I've thought of little else," Thomas admitted. "I couldn't sleep last night. I kept reviewing cases from the past months, wondering how many times I've done the same thing." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Thomas sighed. "Too many to count." The waitress returned with their food. After she left, Margaret spoke again. "Tell me about yourself, Thomas. How did you become a judge?" The question surprised him. People rarely asked about his journey. "I was a solicitor for 20 years. Local practice, nothing fancy. When Judge Peters retired, I was nominated to replace him. It seemed like the natural progression." "And do you enjoy it?" Margaret asked, her eyes intent on his face. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I used to, very much. The responsibility felt important. Upholding the law, serving the community." He paused. "But lately, it's become routine. Cases blur together, faces too." Margaret nodded. "The danger of experience is that it can lead to assumption. We think we've seen it all before." "Is that what happened to you, in your years as Chief Justice?" Thomas asked. Margaret took a sip of water. "I faced different challenges. Political pressure, death threats when we ruled against powerful interests." She smiled slightly at Thomas's shocked expression. "But yes, I too found it difficult sometimes to see each case with fresh eyes." "How did you overcome that?" "I started a practice that my colleagues thought was strange," Margaret said. "Before each case, I would look at a photograph of my grandmother. She never learned to read or write, but she was the wisest person I've known. I would ask myself, would she understand why I made this decision?" Thomas considered this. "Your personal touchstone of justice." "Exactly. What's yours, Thomas?" The question caught him off guard. He had never thought about it that way. "I don't have one," he realized aloud. Maybe that's part of the problem. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Through the window, Thomas watched students crossing the green lawn of the campus, young faces full of purpose. "Yesterday in my chambers," Thomas said finally, "you mentioned that what happened to you happens to others without diplomatic passports to save them. People who aren't heard." Margaret nodded. "Yes. I've been thinking about that all night." Thomas continued. "About justice and fairness in my courtroom. About who gets heard and who doesn't." "And?" Margaret prompted gently. "And I think I need to change how I run my court," Thomas said firmly. "But I'm not sure where to begin." Margaret's eyes lit up. "Actually, I may have a suggestion. Before I became Chief Justice, I helped design a judicial training program focused on unconscious bias and equal access to justice. It's been implemented in 7 countries now. Could something like that work here in Bridgewater? Thomas asked, feeling a spark of hope for the first time since their meeting. It would need adaptation to your legal system, but yes, I believe. It could, Margaret replied. In fact, that's part of why I'm here at the university, to explore bringing the program to the UK. Thomas leaned forward, his soup forgotten. Would you tell me more about it? As Margaret began explaining the program, Thomas felt something shift inside him. What had begun as a simple traffic violation was transforming into something far more significant, a chance to redefine justice in his courtroom, to become the judge he had always believed himself to be. For the first time in years, Thomas Brown felt truly awake. 3 weeks had passed since that lunch at the university cafe. Thomas sat in his chambers early on a Tuesday morning, reviewing the proposal he and Margaret had drafted together. The document outlined a 6-month training program for all judicial officers in the district. It was ambitious, but Thomas felt more energized than he had in years. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. George, the bailiff, poked his head in. "Sir, the chief magistrate is here to see you." Thomas straightened his tie nervously. "Send him in, please." William Pearson, chief magistrate for the entire region, entered the room. At 68, he was a tall man with bushy eyebrows and a reputation for being resistant to change. "Thomas," William greeted him with a firm handshake. "I received your proposal yesterday. Thought I'd come discuss it in person rather than sending an email." Thomas gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where Margaret had sat that first day. "I appreciate that, William. I know it's unusual." William settled into the chair with a slight grunt. "Unusual is putting it mildly. You're proposing a complete overhaul of how we conduct court proceedings. Mandatory training for all judges, community observers in courtrooms, regular case review sessions." He shook his head. "It's unprecedented. The current system isn't working for everyone," Thomas said carefully. "Some voices aren't being heard." William studied him curiously. "This isn't like you, Thomas. You've always been by the book. What's changed?" Thomas considered his answer carefully. "I had an experience that made me question my approach to justice. I realized I've been going through the motions, not seeing the people in front of me. This has something to do with that Diplomat, doesn't it? The parking ticket case. Word gets around." Thomas nodded. "Dr. Jenkins helped me see blind spots I didn't know I had. She has extensive experience with similar training programs internationally." William leaned back, crossing his arms. "And who's going to pay for all this? The courts are already stretched thin." "Dr. Jenkins has connections with several international justice foundations. She believes we could secure funding for a pilot program." Thomas slid a second document across the desk. "She's already received preliminary approval from 2 of them." William's eyebrows rose as he scanned the funding proposals. "These are significant amounts. The foundations see value in establishing this model in the UK. If it succeeds here, it could be replicated elsewhere." William was quiet for a long moment, tapping his fingers on the arm of the chair. Thomas waited, heart pounding. Without the chief magistrate's support, the program would never happen. "You know," William finally said, "I had a case last month. Young man, first offense. I was about to give him the standard sentence when his grandmother stood up in the courtroom. Asked to speak." He paused. "Usually I'd say no, but something made me let her talk. She told me about how the boy had been caring for her through cancer treatment, how he'd made one mistake after missing 2 nights of sleep." Thomas listened intently. "I reduced his sentence, ordered community service instead," William continued. "Later found out he's now enrolled in nursing school, inspired by the nurses who helped his grandmother." He looked up at Thomas. "I wonder how many stories like that I've missed by not really listening." Hope sparked in Thomas's chest. "That's exactly what this program addresses." William handed the papers back to Thomas. "I can't approve this alone. You'll need to present it to the full Judicial Council next month. And if they approve? Then you have my support," William said, standing up. But you'll need to be convincing. Most of them are even more set in their ways than I am. After William left, Thomas immediately called Margaret. When she answered, he could hear the sounds of a busy cafe in the background. The chief magistrate wants me to present to the full council, Thomas told her. That's wonderful news, Margaret said, her voice warm with excitement. When? Next month. Will you still be here? I could really use your help preparing. My lecture series ends in 2 weeks, she replied, but I can request an extension from the UN. This is important work, Thomas. It is, he agreed. I've spent my career thinking I was serving justice. Now I realize I've only been serving some people's justice. That realization alone puts you ahead of many judges I've known, Margaret said gently, as they made plans to meet and prepare for the council presentation. Thomas glanced at the calendar on his desk. 3 weeks ago, he would have dismissed the idea of changing the court system as impossible and unnecessary. Now he couldn't imagine doing anything more important. A simple parking ticket had opened his eyes to something profound. Justice wasn't just about following rules. It was about truly seeing the people those rules were meant to serve. The grand meeting hall of the Regional Judicial Center buzzed with voices. 30 judges from across the district had gathered for the quarterly council meeting. At the front of the room, Thomas arranged his papers at the podium, trying to calm his nerves. Beside him, Margaret looked composed in a deep green suit, reviewing her notes one final time. Are you ready? She asked quietly. Thomas nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. William Pearson called the meeting to order. The room gradually fell silent as judges took their seats. Most were men over 50, though Thomas noticed more women and younger faces than in previous years. Next on our agenda, William announced, Judge Thomas Brown will present a proposal for a new judicial training program. Judge Brown, the floor is yours. Thomas stepped up to the podium. Looking out at his colleagues, people he'd known for years but rarely spoken to deeply, he felt a momentary doubt. Then he saw Margaret's encouraging nod. Thank you, Chief Magistrate, Thomas began. 2 months ago, a woman appeared in my courtroom for a simple parking violation. I treated her case like dozens of others that morning, quickly, dismissively, without truly listening. The room was very quiet now. Judges rarely admitted mistakes so openly. That woman was Dr. Margaret Jenkins, former Chief Justice and UN diplomat. But the real issue wasn't who she was. It was who I had become as a judge. Someone who didn't truly see the people before me. Thomas explained the proposal, the training sessions on unconscious bias, the community feedback panels, the peer review process. As he spoke, he noticed some judges nodding while others frowned or whispered to neighbors. This isn't just about being nicer in court, Thomas clarified. It's about better justice, about ensuring everyone truly gets their day in court, not just those who look or sound like us. When Thomas finished, Margaret presented data from countries where similar programs had been implemented. The numbers were compelling. Higher public trust in courts, fewer appeals, and even improved efficiency, despite taking more time with each case. Then came the questions. Judge Richard Cooper, known for his traditional views, spoke first. This sounds expensive and time-consuming. We already have massive backlogs. Initially, yes, Margaret acknowledged, but the data shows that within a year, courts actually become more efficient. When people feel heard, cases resolve more quickly. Judge Helen Parker, one of the younger judges, raised her hand. I'm curious about the community panels. Who would serve on them? How would we ensure they understand legal procedures? Thomas explained the selection process they had designed, emphasizing that the panels would observe and provide feedback, but not influence actual decisions. For nearly an hour, the questions continued. Some supportive, others skeptical or outright opposed. Throughout it all, Thomas felt strangely calm. Win or lose, he knew this fight was worth having. Finally, William called for a vote. All in favor of approving a 1-year pilot program as outlined? Hands went up around the room. Thomas counted silently. 15, 18, 21. A majority. Motion passed, William announced. Judge Brown, you'll head the implementation committee. Choose 4 other judges to assist you. As the meeting moved to other business, Thomas and Margaret stepped into the hallway. The reality of what had just happened was slowly sinking in. We did it, Thomas said in disbelief. Margaret smiled warmly. You did it, Thomas. I merely provided information. What happens now? Your lecture series is ending soon. I've spoken with my superiors at the UN, Margaret replied. They've agreed to extend my placement here for 6 months to help launch the program. They see value in establishing this model in the UK. Relief flooded Thomas. The task ahead seemed less daunting knowing Margaret would be there to guide them. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, Thomas said. That day in traffic court, why didn't you immediately show your diplomatic passport? Why let me make that mistake? Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. In that moment, I was curious. Would you listen to me without knowing my title? Would you see me as a person worthy of being heard? She paused. Many judges wouldn't have invited me to their chambers afterward. Fewer still would have taken it this far. 6 months later, Thomas sat in his courtroom watching a young trainee judge handle a case. The new procedures were in place, taking time to hear each person fully, explaining decisions clearly, checking for understanding. In the observer section, 2 community panel members took notes. The courtroom moved more slowly now, but with greater purpose. When Thomas looked at the people who came before his court, he truly saw them, their anxiety, their hope for fairness, their humanity. What had begun with a simple parking ticket had transformed not just one judge or one courtroom, but an entire judicial district. And soon, perhaps, much more.